Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
The text I woke up to said that my sister Laura had asked mom and dad to leave me out of Christmas this year, and the part that nearly knocked the air out of me was not even the request itself, but the fact that they agreed so quickly and quietly that it made me wonder if they had been waiting for the chance, like they were relieved someone finally said it out loud. And as I sat there staring at my phone, I realized I was not even shocked. Just gutted in that familiar way you feel when something you always suspected finally gets confirmed. I did not respond right away, because I knew if I did the words would come out desperate or defensive or worse, and I have spent enough years being painted as the problem that I was not about to hand them more ammunition, so instead I sat on it for hours. And when Mom finally called me that evening to explain, her voice was soft in that fake kind of way she uses when she knows she's wrong but refuses to admit it, and she said Laura only wanted a peaceful Christmas, and she felt it was easier if I just let it go this time. What burned me was how she framed it as if I were the disruption, as if Laura excluding me was some kind of act of generosity they were doing for my sake. And I kept thinking back to every holiday where I bent myself into knots to keep the peace while Laura got to stir the pot, throw her little barbs, roll her eyes at me across the table, and still somehow leave the room looking like the golden one while I walked out looking like the bitter one. So I asked Mom, point blank, did you tell her that was cruel? Did you tell her this is my family too? And Mom went silent in the kind of silence that tells you everything, and then she gave me the line I could recite in my sleep, the one she has been using for decades. It's just not worth the fight. And hearing it again in that moment flipped a switch in me, because I realized that in this family, not worth the fight has always meant not worth protecting you, and once you understand that you can't unknow it. Laura called later that night, not to apologize but to gloat, because that's who she is when she knows she has won, and she told me it wasn't personal, she just didn't want drama around her kids on Christmas morning. And the arrogance in her tone lit something in me that I had been holding back for years, but instead of snapping I stayed calm and let her talk, because letting someone dig their own hole is always more satisfying than grabbing the shovel yourself. By the time she hung up, I had already made a decision that I would not tell them I was hurt, I would not beg them to reconsider, and I would not spend another holiday proving that I was strong enough to sit at a table where I was barely tolerated. I was done playing the game where Laura held all the power because she knew how to spin the narrative and Mom and Dad went along with it to keep the fake peace. The next morning, while I was still sitting with my coffee, I opened my banking app and remembered that years ago, when Laura's credit was a mess, I had added her as an authorized user on one of my accounts to help her rebuild. And I never thought much of it because she barely used it, but in that moment it felt like the perfect place to start cutting strings. So I removed her name without a second thought, hit save, and felt a rush of satisfaction I had not felt in years, because even if it was small, it was mine. A few hours later, Laura texted me again, not about Christmas, but because her card had been declined at a store, and she asked if there was an issue with the account, and I typed back, "You asked me to be excluded from Christmas. So I'm respecting your wish and extending that exclusion to everything else," and then I put my phone down before I could second-guess it, and I swear I laughed out loud for the first time in days. When Mom called that evening, probably after Laura had cried to her about it, I did not answer, because what was there left to say? And as I let the call ring out, I felt the first taste of the freedom I had been too afraid to grab for most of my life. And that's when I knew this was only the beginning, because if they thought excluding me from Christmas was going to break me, they had no idea what was coming next. When the initial sting of Laura's words and my parents' quiet agreement had settled into something colder, something heavier that seemed to press against me every time I walked into my own kitchen or tried to fall asleep at night, I began to realize that what had just happened was not an isolated moment of holiday tension, but the clearest proof yet of a truth I had been circling around for years, the truth being that in our family, whenever Laura wanted something, no matter how unreasonable, no matter how cruel or self-serving, everyone else adjusted themselves to fit her comfort while my own comfort was negotiable, disposable, or simply irrelevant. A day after the text exchange and the call I refused to answer, Mom left me a long voicemail that started with a sigh so dramatic you could almost hear her rehearsing it, and she said that while she knew it might be hard for me, She felt this Christmas could be more peaceful without my energy in the room, and she insisted it wasn't about blame, just about avoiding conflict. As I listened to her words, what struck me wasn't even the decision itself, but the way she spoke as though this were a reasonable compromise, as if the idea of cutting one child out of Christmas was some normal, pragmatic solution rather than an act of brutal favoritism that laid bare everything I had been trying for years not to admit. For so long I had convinced myself that if I just kept my head down, if I smiled through Laura's digs and Mom's dismissals and Dad's silence, eventually things would balance out. Eventually someone would see the pattern and step in. But hearing that message made me understand with perfect clarity that the balancing act I had been waiting for was never going to happen, because no one in that house ever wanted it to happen. The scales had always been tipped, and my role was simply to pretend the tilt was fair. I thought back to high school when Laura got caught skipping classes, and somehow I ended up grounded because I had created stress in the household by arguing with her about using my homework as her own. And then to college when my graduation barely got a mention at the family dinner because Laura was announcing her engagement, and even to my 30th birthday when Dad gave a toast about how proud he was of Laura's career while I sat there, the birthday cake in front of me, smiling for the photos while everyone clapped for her. These memories, stacked one on top of another, came crashing back in those days after the exclusion decision, and instead of drowning me like they used to, they began fueling a quiet rage that was less about tears and more about resolve. When Laura texted me midweek to check in, her tone was smug in that fake sweet way that always meant she wanted to rub something in. And she told me she hoped I would understand that she just wanted the holiday to be special for her kids, and that sometimes sacrifices had to be made for the sake of children's happiness. The audacity of framing my erasure as a noble sacrifice she was asking of me nearly made me choke, and though my fingers itched to fire back, I forced myself to breathe and recognize that silence was my greatest weapon, because silence made her nervous. Silence denied her the satisfaction of seeing me beg or lash out, and silence gave me space to start planning. Dad finally called me too, not with anger but with that heavy, resigned tone he has perfected over the years, the one where he pretends he's neutral while doing absolutely nothing to correct the imbalance. And he said something about how I should not take it personally, and how Christmas is just one day, and there will be plenty of other times to see each other. It was such a lazy attempt at soothing me that I nearly laughed, because what he didn't realize is that by minimizing it, by telling me not to make it a big deal, he was confirming exactly how little my place in this family had ever mattered to them. So instead of arguing with him, I let him talk, and when he asked if I was okay, I said simply, "I'm fine, Dad," and hung up, because I realized that feeding them my hurt was feeding them power, and I wasn't going to do it anymore. I was going to turn this rejection into a weapon they wouldn't see coming, because sometimes the most dangerous move you can make is not to fight when they expect you to fight, but to wait until they have settled into their smug certainty and then cut them off at the knees in one clean motion. By the time the weekend rolled around and I watched their family group chat fill with cheerful messages about what dishes they were all bringing to Laura's house, I felt strangely calm. I wasn't panicking, I wasn't spiraling, I wasn't even angry in the way I had been before. I was simply done. Done trying to wedge myself into a family that only wanted me when I was silent. Done handing over years of my life to a system built to elevate Laura at my expense. Done pretending that exclusion was something I had to fight against rather than something I could turn back on them. And while they thought they had successfully pushed me out, what they couldn't see yet was that they had given me the opening I needed, because once you stop fighting for scraps at someone else's table, you finally realize you can flip the whole damn table over. And that is when the real shift begins. What none of them knew was that the next time Laura showed up at my door, smug and entitled, I would not be the quiet sister swallowing her pride. I would be the one deciding who stayed and who got thrown out, and I was already more than ready to make that choice. When the first knock came, sharp and impatient like she had every right to interrupt my Saturday morning, I already knew it was Laura because no one else in my life had the gall to show up unannounced, expecting to be welcomed in without question. And as I stood there staring at the door, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that used to come before every family gathering where I would brace myself for whatever cutting remark she had prepared. But this time, instead of dread, there was a kind of calm readiness, the kind you feel when you finally know you're not about to play defense anymore. She barely waited for me to open the door before pushing past me with that entitled stride she had been practicing since high school, talking as she moved into my living room as if the house were hers. And she started in immediately about how she hoped I wasn't planning to make Christmas harder than it had to be because, in her words, we've all agreed this year needs to be about the kids. And she smiled, that fake diplomatic smile that has gotten her out of trouble her whole life, the one that says she thinks she's already won before the conversation even begins. For a moment I let her talk, let her lay out her little speech about unity and peace and how I should take the high road for once and stop trying to make things about me, and though the words might have cut me in the past, now they just sounded hollow, rehearsed, and desperate. Because for all her confidence, she still felt the need to show up on my doorstep to hammer her point home, and that told me everything I needed to know about just how rattled she was by my silence. I asked her calmly why she thought she had the authority to dictate who our parents invited to Christmas, and she laughed in that condescending way she does when she wants to make me feel small, saying it wasn't her call, it was Mom's and Dad's. And she was simply the one brave enough to say out loud what everyone had been thinking for years, that I brought tension wherever I went. Listening to her claim that excluding me was some kind of collective decision almost made me laugh, because it was so obviously her own selfish demand dressed up as family consensus, and I could see how badly she wanted me to rise to it, to beg, to prove her point that I was reactive and dramatic. But instead of giving her the fight she wanted, I sat down in my own chair, folded my arms, and let her keep talking. Because every sentence she said made her look less like a confident sister protecting her family and more like a spoiled child afraid her control was slipping. She went on about how I should understand the bigger picture, about how her kids deserved stability, about how my attitude ruined special days, and finally she leaned in and, with that little smirk, said that maybe if I had made better life choices, people would actually want me around. That was the moment the calm in me shifted into something sharper, because while I had spent years swallowing her digs about my career, my relationships, and my choices, this time the words didn't land the way she expected. They didn't break me down. They built me up, brick by brick, until I was ready to finally lay down a boundary so solid she wouldn't be able to wriggle around it with charm or guilt. I stood up slowly, looked her straight in the eye, and told her, "This is my house, not yours, and you don't get to come here, insult me, and expect to walk out feeling like you won." For a split second she blinked, caught off guard by the fact that I wasn't raising my voice or shaking with anger, but speaking with a kind of steady control she had never heard from me before, and then she tried to laugh it off, muttering something about me being sensitive, but the crack in her confidence was already showing. The silence that followed stretched longer than she was comfortable with, and I could see the panic just under the surface as she realized she might not be holding the reins this time. When she reached for her bag and started toward the door like she was dismissing herself on her own terms, I stepped aside, but not before saying, "The next time you come here, make sure you're invited, because walking in uninvited won't end the way you think it will." She froze for a second, her back stiff, clearly debating whether to snap back or keep walking, and for the first time in my life I saw her unsure, unsteady, and small in a way I had never seen her before. She muttered something under her breath, opened the door, and left without slamming it, which for Laura was as close to retreat as it gets. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, I felt an almost physical shift, like something heavy had been lifted that had been pressing on me for decades, and I realized this was not just about Christmas. It was about every time I had ever let her win by default, every time I had let silence equal surrender. And while I knew she would run crying to Mom and Dad and spin the story to make me look unreasonable, I also knew that this time it wouldn't matter, because I had finally claimed the one space where her power meant nothing, my own home. What I didn't know then was how fast she would try to retaliate, and that the retaliation wouldn't come through texts or calls, but in the form of dragging my parents into it, which would soon bring all of them to my doorstep, knocking on a door I already knew I wouldn't open. When Laura showed up at my house again only 2 days later, this time with an air of smug certainty that she had regained the upper hand, I already knew before I opened the door that I was not going to let the conversation unfold the way it always had in the past. Where she would push and provoke, I would try to keep calm, and somehow I would walk away carrying the blame for the outcome, because this time I had reached the point where the cycle was not only unbearable, but completely unnecessary. And I was prepared to end it in a way that left no room for misinterpretation about whose house this was and whose rules mattered inside of it. She stepped in without waiting, as if the first warning had never been given, and immediately began talking in that falsely reasonable tone she uses when she wants to cloak her arrogance in the language of family concern, telling me that Mom and Dad were worried sick about me, that I was overreacting by taking things personally, and that if I wanted any relationship with the family moving forward, I needed to stop making such a big deal about Christmas and just accept reality. I watched her wander through my living room like it was an extension of her own home, dropping her bag on the couch, taking up space, radiating the same entitlement she had been granted by our parents since childhood. And I felt a steadiness inside me that was almost startling, because for once I was not rattled or flustered or desperate to argue my side. I was simply ready to end the charade once and for all. I told her calmly that she was not welcome here if all she intended to do was repeat the same script she had delivered before, and that if she had come expecting me to fold, she had badly miscalculated. She laughed, not nervously but arrogantly, the kind of laugh that said she still believed I was bluffing, that I would never dare push her out. Because in her mind she had always been the immovable center of our family, and I had always been the one orbiting on the margins, waiting for scraps of approval. She sat down on the arm of the chair across from me and said with that smirk, "You wouldn't actually throw me out, because then you'd be proving my point, that you're the problem." It was a clever line in theory, meant to trap me in a paradox, but what she didn't realize was that I no longer cared about her point, or Mom's point, or Dad's point, or any version of their reality where my silence was considered maturity and my boundaries were considered drama. I leaned forward, looked her directly in the eye, and told her, in a voice steady enough to make even her blink, "This isn't your house, and you don't decide what happens here, so you're going to get up, take your bag, and leave. Because I don't allow people who insult me under my own roof to stay another second." She froze, just for a fraction of a moment, the way someone does when they hear words they did not expect, and then she scoffed, muttering that I was ridiculous, but her movements betrayed her because she grabbed her bag quickly. More quickly than she wanted me to notice, and she stood up with a stiffness that gave away how unsettled she truly was. She tried to recover her composure by saying that Mom and Dad would hear about this, that I was isolating myself, that I would regret pushing family away, but the words didn't land. Because the only thing I heard underneath them was the panic of someone who had just lost control in a space where she thought she could never lose. When she walked toward the door, I followed, not in anger but in quiet authority, and as she stepped outside I said, "From this moment on, if you want to come here, you need an invitation, and if you show up without one, you won't get past the door." She didn't respond, didn't even try to slam the door behind her, and for Laura, silence was the loudest admission of defeat she could possibly give. As soon as the door shut, I picked up my phone, opened every thread that connected me to her, to Mom, to Dad, to the entire network that had kept me tied down for decades, and I hit block one by one, not out of spite, but out of liberation. Because I realized that for years my biggest fear had been being cut off, when in truth the greatest gift I could give myself was cutting the cord myself on my own terms. The moment the final block was confirmed, I felt a clarity so sharp it was almost physical, like the noise of their voices had finally stopped echoing in my head, leaving behind a silence that wasn't lonely but peaceful. I spent that evening alone, cooking dinner, watching a show I enjoyed, not once checking my phone for their reactions, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider in my own family. I felt like someone who had finally chosen herself over a system designed to keep her small. And while I knew Laura would run to them, crying, spinning her story, trying to make me look like the unstable one, I also knew it wouldn't matter anymore, because she no longer had access to me, no longer had the right to barge in and dictate the narrative. But late that night, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, the sound of pounding at the door pulled me back up, hard and fast, and as I sat there in the dark listening to the angry, desperate knocks and the muffled voices outside, I realized they had come together, all of them, united not by love, but by outrage at the fact that I had finally done the one thing they never expected. I had closed the door on them before they could close it on me. And in that moment, as the pounding grew louder, I knew I wasn't going to open it, because the real revenge, the one they would never be able to spin away, was not slamming the door, not yelling through it, but simply never unlocking it again. The pounding on the door started as something sharp and insistent, almost as if they believed the sheer force of their hands against the wood would be enough to undo everything that had just taken place. But as I sat there in the silence of my own living room, my phone placed face down on the table with all of them blocked, I realized that what they were actually doing was not trying to reach me, but trying to resurrect the old dynamic, the one where I would always fold first, where I would always run to smooth things over, where I would let their disapproval scare me into compliance. And the more I listened, the more I understood that those knocks were not a demand for reconciliation, but a desperate attempt to keep control they had already lost. I could hear Laura's voice rise above the others, sharp and shrill, insisting that I was being dramatic, insisting that I was humiliating myself, insisting that I was destroying the family, and in the background Mom's softer tone tried to weave through, coaxing rather than demanding, using the same lines she had used my entire life, about how we were family, how nothing mattered more than togetherness, how I was overreacting and needed to just open the door so we could talk it through. But what Mom never seemed to realize was that talking it through always meant listening to Laura, soothing Laura, adjusting myself around Laura, and every time I had done it in the past, the only result was me walking away smaller while Laura walked away satisfied. And now that I had finally broken free of that loop, I knew with absolute certainty that opening the door would be the same as handing the key back to the very prison I had just escaped. There was a moment when Dad's voice came through, low and heavy, saying he couldn't believe I would treat them this way, that he had always tried to be fair, that he had always loved me, and for just a flicker I felt the old pull of guilt. The one that told me I owed him something because he had provided, because he had kept a roof over my head, because he had claimed neutrality in a household where neutrality meant letting one child trample the other without stepping in. And then it hit me how ridiculous it was to let that kind of guilt dictate my choices at nearly 40 years old, when the reality was that fairness had never existed in our house. And love that required me to disappear so someone else could shine was not a love worth opening the door for. The knocking went on, sometimes softer as if they were regrouping, sometimes louder as if anger might succeed where pleading had failed, and at one point I could hear Laura say that she wasn't leaving until I faced her, that she would sit outside all night if she had to. And it almost made me laugh, because for someone who prided herself on always winning, she had no idea how exposed she looked now, pounding on a door that would not budge, calling out to someone who no longer cared to answer, trying to perform power for an audience that no longer existed. I sat there in the dim quiet, sipping the glass of water I had poured before bed, and I thought about every holiday where I had swallowed my pride just to be allowed at the table, every birthday or milestone where my achievements had been overshadowed, every conversation where my needs had been framed as inconveniences, and I realized that this moment, this door between us, was the first time the power had shifted completely, because for once it was them on the outside wanting in, and me on the inside choosing not to give them access. It would have been easy to yell through the door, to scream out every grievance, to let them know exactly how deeply they had hurt me, but I understood that doing so would have put me right back in the role they expected, the one where I was reactive, emotional, easy to dismiss, and instead I knew the silence was more powerful than any speech I could deliver. The silence was not weakness this time, it was the strongest boundary I had ever set. The kind that cannot be debated, cannot be twisted, cannot be reframed to suit their story. Eventually the pounding grew less frequent, the voices more tired, and then the night settled back into quiet, and I lay down knowing that they might try again tomorrow or the next day, but that nothing would change because the decision had already been made. I had chosen not to open the door, Not just tonight, but from this point forward, and while it might leave them stewing in confusion or rage or self-righteousness, it left me with a peace I had not felt in decades. As I closed my eyes, I whispered to myself that I was finally free, not because they had accepted me, not because they had changed, but because I had stopped needing them to. And for the first time I understood that the greatest revenge was not throwing their words back at them, not exposing every lie, but simply living without their permission, without their validation, without their control. And so while they knocked and shouted and pleaded on the other side of the door, I didn't move, I didn't answer, and I didn't unlock it, because the story wasn't about them anymore, it was about me. And about the fact that sometimes the most powerful victory is not winning the fight they try to drag you into, but refusing to fight at all and still walking away as the one who finally, irrevocably, won.